Does anyone feel like this cup is getting lonely? I feel like I should take a sip. That is good daring change water. You can taste the daring. Today I'm going to speculate about the pipeline of US high school students and how that pipeline is changing and how that change will shape the future of colleges like Williams. I'm going to confine myself today to talking just about kids from the United States, leaving for another day the topic of the globalization of higher education. I take for granted that international students greatly enrich the social and intellectual climate of the college, but for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to focus on the United States, for which demographic data are both available and clear. The data are clear that over the next 20 years, this country will face and experience a major demographic change. These changes could wipe out a few small New England colleges. Williams will not be one of those colleges. President Jack Sawyer gave us something that will shelter Williams from this upcoming demographic storm, and that gift is diversification. Other speakers today, more eloquent than I, have and will discuss the proven social and educational benefit of a diverse learning environment. I intend to use the word diversification in a slightly different sense than they, in the sense of the mutual fund analyst who diversifies investments in order to moderate risk. This is a separate and I think underappreciated and perhaps even unintended benefit of Sawyer's diversification. I'm going to talk about this in the context of two specific types of change that the college will face in the next 20 years. First, changing geographic populations, and second, changing racial composition within those populations. But first, let's talk about geography, because I love maps. I'm a map guy. There's a concept that I'm particularly fond of called the mean center of population. It's used to show how populations change over long periods of time. The mean center of population is the point at which an imaginary, flat, weightless, and rigid map would balance if weights, like marbles, were placed such that each marble represented a person. So, for example, the mean center of population, given that kind of more people are over here, but you guys are balancing it out, the mean center of population of this room would be about where this young lady is in the first row. We can use this mean center of population concept to show America's westward expansion. If we look at the first US census in 1790, the mean center of the country's population was there in the Chesapeake Bay. And 200 years of US history can pass us by decade by decade. By today, or in the most recent US census in 2010, the country's mean center of population has expanded westward to just outside of Plato, Missouri. This made me wonder, where's the mean center of Williams' population? What if our students were the marbles? Where would they balance, and how would that have changed over the 200 years since Williams was founded? So I mapped that. There's Williamstown up there, and one of our very first freshman classes in 1795, mostly drawn from Massachusetts and the New England states surrounding. And for 100 years, we basically drew young men from New England, but then started to attract students from a little further west, over time, through Pennsylvania. It's worth pausing actually in this decade, the 1970s. Noteworthy here is that this decade captures the years when Williams went co-ed, and note that the next decade, 1980, actually jumps back eastward. It's tempting to speculate that those earliest co-ed classes would likely have been attracting a lot of East Coast women who a decade before might have gone to places like Mount Holyoke, Smith, and Vassar. But we pick up that westward trend again, and in one of our more recent freshman classes, the mean center of our population has moved over to Indiana. There are three noteworthy things, I think, here. First is that our mean center of population moves at all. There are plenty of schools whose mean centers are and have always been within a few hundred, if not dozens, of miles of their campuses. Second, in the 50 years since the Sawyer presidency, our mean center has moved as far as it moved in the first 150 years of Williams' history. So something or a series of things happened during the past 50 years that contributed disproportionately to our expansion. And third, that the Williams mean center does not reflect the US mean center. Indeed, we end up roughly where the US mean center was 100 years ago. So I take from this map that Williams has become a more national college than its rural Massachusetts roots, and that much of that happened in the last 50 years, but Williams has not expanded to the same extent or at the same rate as the nation. So then I got worried. We think of ourselves as a national college with a national reputation. What does it mean to be a national college? Where should our mean center of population be? To answer that, I looked at our mean center relative to that of some of our peers. So here's the country, again, the country's mean center, and we can overlay our own, and this is all 4 classes combined, so we jump back into Ohio. But we can overlay some of our peers, such as Amherst, and see that we're neck and neck with Amherst. Although, to be fair, we do have a 40-mile head start. So we can do the same thing with other peers. Here's Bates all the way from Lewiston, Maine, Davidson from North Carolina, Yale from New Haven, a little further, Pomona from Southern California, and Whitman College from Walla Walla, Washington. I include Whitman here for a couple of reasons. One is that I like to say Walla Walla, but the second is that it's a great West Coast counterpoint to Williams as a small liberal arts college with a campus in the middle of nowhere. Also, some people even refer to Whitman as the Williams of the West. But noteworthy, I think, are a couple of things. First of all, these are all national colleges, and you can tell that because they're all drawn to varying degrees towards the country's mean center of population, as if to a black hole. Secondly, Yale, which is as national as they come, is closest, but is still not at or even really near the country's mean center of population. So from this, I get convinced that while Williams and these peer schools are national schools, they still retain traditional regional strengths. But that doesn't tell me if we're seeing a worrisome degree of regionality, an overdependence or an overinvestment in any given region, or not, because the mean center of population doesn't actually measure the representativeness of the college's enrollment. For example, the mean center of population of the University of Missouri at St. Louis is even closer to the country's, but surely that doesn't mean that the University of Missouri's enrollment is more representative of the geographic diversity of the United States. It begs the question, what would a perfectly national college even look like? In other words, what would it mean to completely diversify along the dimension of US population? And here's a map of the US high school students graduating this spring. So think of this as the shape of the total market for prospective college students this year. In a geographically representative college, 5% of the enrollment would come from New England, 35% from the South, 23% from the West, etc. So think of that distribution of high school students as the index fund. We can compare it to a few colleges' actual enrollments and ask ourselves which of these portfolios, if you will, is tracking the index most closely and which are overweighted in certain markets or underweighted. So let's put that question to the eyeball test. Take a moment, ask yourselves which of these schools looks most like the index. So by a show of hands, how many chose school A? How many chose school C? And how many chose school D?
C or D?
D. We'll skip to D. Okay, and I think we can actually discount some of these pretty easily, like F. But it's interesting. So that's what I would have said as well. That's Yale. So it's not surprising that people chose Yale. What's interesting to me is that actually you have to take a minute to actually see the difference between some of these, especially between Williams and Amherst. They're a lot like each other in terms of their representation. But we can zoom in for a moment on our enrollment and see that 25% of our students come from New England and about half from the Northeast. Bates is a good example of a peer college with an even bigger Northeast exposure. Over half of their enrollment comes from the 6 New England states alone. Davidson is the same sort of thing, but their particular strength is in the South. And Pomona is the same idea, but from the opposite coast. Noteworthy here is that a huge proportion of Pomona's Western market strength is in the state of California itself. So that's the current market for high school students and how we and a few of our peers perform in that market. But what do we know about the future of the market? We know that we are coming off a 20-year boom for higher education, and that boom is over. For the past 20 years, it has been relatively easy for colleges to get more selective every year, because every year there are more kids to choose from than there were the year before. But we've peaked. That pool of high school students is leveling off, and a lot of colleges are going to feel acute pain as a result. Why? Because the underlying demographic changes will not be evenly distributed. Up until now, every region has experienced year-over-year growth, but now the only growth area is in the South, and all the others will be basically flat or in decline. Schools that have geographic strengths in growing markets will benefit, and schools in declining markets will lose as this demographic wave crashes over them. Who's going to be hit the hardest? Schools that rely on a high school base in New England. New England will experience a 16% drop in high school graduates. Likewise, the Midwest will lose about 7%. The South, on the other hand, will increase by 5% over this period. We can drill down even further into this expected change and look at it by state. The hot colors here indicate growing high school populations, and the cool colors indicate shrinking ones. Noteworthy here is California out there with its huge population, poised to experience some pretty significant declines. With the exception of California, we see that most of the western and southern states are net high school gainers, and that most of the northeast states are net high school losers over this period. We know one more thing about the pipeline of high school grads, and that is that these high schoolers are getting more racially diverse. By 2027, total US high school grads are expected to be almost 50% minority, driven by growth in the Hispanic and, to a lesser extent, Asian populations. To those US demographic data, we can apply another set of data, this time internal data. We know that our popularity, or market penetration, if you will, varies by region and also by race, and thus by race within region. So for example, 9 out of 1,000 Asian kids from the Mid-Atlantic will apply to Williams, but only about 3 out of 1,000 white kids from the Mid-Atlantic will. So a rising Asian high school population in the Mid-Atlantic can act to disproportionately offset a declining white high school population in the Mid-Atlantic. Knowing these market share data, we can ask, what do anticipated US regional and racial changes mean for colleges with historic strengths in particular regions and different market penetrations into different demographic groups within those regions? What does it mean for them? For example, what will it mean for Williams in the Northeast, Pomona in the West, and Davidson in the South? Based on these data, I project that over the next 15 years, our applications will decline slightly, rise, and then fall to end up close to where they are today. Davidson, on the other hand, is insulated from applicant loss by its natural strength in the growing South. It will become more selective as its applications grow over time. Pomona will dip slightly more in the short term in applications because of its relative overinvestment in that shrinking California market. Then it will bounce back and also finish off about flat. I want to pause and make a point here, and that is that this slight decline is actually great news. When I see that our applications will decline by just 2%, when I know that underlying that is a 16% decline in our strongest market, New England, I'm relieved. The reason this line looks as good as it does is because we diversified as much as we did, especially in the last 50 years. Remember, I'm using the word diversified in the sense of like a stockbroker might, in the sense of spreading risk. All of our eggs are no longer in the New England basket, nor are they in the white kid basket. We've spread those eggs out. But imagine you are a small college that draws students almost exclusively from New England, and that you haven't achieved much racial diversity. Your fate is tied to the future population of white New England kids, and you should worry. Looking at Williams closely, by region, we can predict that we'll lose almost 200 applications from New England, and we'll experience not quite offsetting gains in applications from the South. Applications from other regions will remain pretty flat. We can look at the same trend by race and predict that our application gains will come from Asian and Hispanic high school students, offsetting expected losses in applications from white students. The most growth will come from Asian population because of our relatively higher market share among Asian students. So will these changes in the applicant pool translate into changes felt on campus? Yes, if history is any guide, then the larger number of Asian and Hispanic applications will yield a larger number of enrolled students. By 2027, we will be 50% non-white. Compare that to today, and compare today to 1976, just after the Sawyer era, when Asian and Hispanic students were practically non-existent. If we look today like we did in 1976, I dare say we'd find it difficult to weather the upcoming demographic changes. We would be one of those small New England colleges facing an uncertain future. Thankfully, Sawyer and leaders since him dared to change Williams in ways that expanded its national reach and made Williams more racially diverse. Both are steps that leave us in good shape to navigate the next 20 years.